Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
There you go. Welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. I'm your host. And I do want to talk about something that I have talked about in the past. But look, we are getting towards the end of Black History Month. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't at least address racism and the battles that we as Native people and Black people have really been engaged in since colonization, and we still are engaged in today. So what I want to talk about is blatant racism and latent racism, not versus, but the two issues. And part of, I think, we hear a lot about being an anti-racist as opposed to just saying, well, I'm not a racist. And part of that is associated with trying to step up and not just be silent when you are experiencing or encountering, something that really somebody should speak up, whether it's, suggesting to somebody that perhaps their racist joke wasn't very funny, or perhaps confronting it a little bit more. Two Martin Luther King quotes come to mind. It says, one, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. That's one of his quotes. And the more famous King quote associated with silence is, in the end, we will be remembered not by the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And, and this course goes in line with how much silence can be not just interpreted as complicity, but indeed is complicity. So, but let me back right up into what I'm calling the show anyway. This blatant racism and latent racism. Now, blatant racism, we all know. These are white supremacists. These are the Proud Boys and the faith, the Oath Keepers, and all of these guys. But then there's what people have referred to as latent racism. It's kind of like the stuff that, well, they don't really do anything that's racist, but they also don't do anything to oppose it. But it goes more than that, because look, even somebody who is not necessarily defined or you could really characterize as a blatant racist, anybody can do something that in many ways can promote or encourage or looked at as being complicit with racism. And the Mascot issue is an example. And I've talked about that a lot on the show. So, and I know that I have. But I mean, if you participate in a practice or in a, either in speech or in action, that once you learn that because perhaps you were just, oblivious to it, once you learn that it is offensive and that it is racist, you get left with a choice. Do you continue on with that same behavior, knowing how it is being perceived by people who are essentially affected by your behavior or your talk? Or do you change it? Because if you continue and then continue to say, well, but I don't really mean anything by it, now you may have crossed that line between being, labeled a latent racist and a blatant racist. And this is some of the difficulty. Now, to be clear, I believe that all racism is born out of ignorance. But even ignorance has different classifications or characterizations. There's ignorance. I mean, and by ignorance I mean you just don't know. You have not had the information available to you, or you have had your thought processes, affected only by one viewpoint. But there's also willful ignorance. And willful ignorance is when you do become aware that what you thought was true is no longer true, but you're still going to maintain a certain philosophy or a set of ideals. And, and this is what we experience with a lot of this stuff. We see people that once you explain to somebody, nah, what you're doing is really not appropriate, they'll either dig in and defend their, either their opinion or their actions or their language, or in many cases they demonstrate even more racism. I've once posted a meme. I said, look, the only thing more racist than a white people using a native mascot is the response when you tell them that it's inappropriate. And look, that's what I'm witnessing. I'm witnessing this back in my old hometown where I went to high school. You can see people who are just losing their minds with this idea that what they've been doing for 50, 60, or 100 years or whatever is somehow inappropriate. And part of what happens is they believe because they've been doing it for so long that it has to be okay. And this is, this is part of the challenge. But for those of us who are trying to educate people and are trying to pull people out of that ignorance, we too have a responsibility. And I think we have to be careful sometimes. We have to be careful that in our attempt to address or confront racism, that we don't just go bullying ahead and knocking people off a cliff. And I say that because, look, even as I've addressed the mascot issue, and not just my current battle with it, but in previous battles, part of it is trying to gear yourself up for the long game, realizing that educating people and trying to change somebody's mind isn't something that you can do by just getting a school board to vote a certain way. Sometimes this is a longer process, and it's a longer process of getting people to understand who we are as a people. Now, and I've said this before also, Native people experience almost a unique form or kind or type of racism, I guess, or the racism that we encounter. Let me put it this way, is different. It isn't necessarily always filled with vitriol and hate, at least not from coming out of the gate. I mean, white supremacy and this idea that somebody can believe that they are superior to you doesn't mean that they necessarily have to believe that they have to hate you. But I'll tell you, it doesn't take much to get somebody who does have that feeling to hate you if you challenge their superiority or their privilege. So, I think sometimes we have to be, and this isn't about trying to be sensitive to their feelings. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm not saying that we need to be nice about it. But I think if our genuine goal is to educate people, it's sometimes it's easier to educate people with with conversation than with a 2x4. And so I think this is some of the things that I want to address here and in this show and at this time. When we see systemic racism, for instance, if you are a part of the system, you don't necessarily have to be a blatant or overt racist, because if the system is systemically racist, then you are going to be a part of that process, and people are going to be victims of that racism, even if you don't consider yourself, or even if others don't consider you to be a racist. Look, the amount of silence that exists, over certain issues is crazy. When you see a black man or woman who was murdered by police, that didn't evoke the same response as Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem in preseason football games. And trust me, all the people who are losing their minds over that, who sit at home every Sunday to watch football, not a damn one of those people stand up in their living room when the national anthem comes on. So I bring this up because we can manage our outrage, and sometimes we manage our outrage over the things that we think will have certain popular support. And the fact that that racism and anti-racism become a right-left conversation is an example of that, because again, it gets tied into the populism and the popularity of of a position that is held. Look, we saw the death of Rush Limbaugh this past week. And look, I think one of the states, they even suggested they wanted to fly their flag at half-mast for a conservative radio show host. And the popularity of his show and the popularity of, say, Fox News or some of these other right-wing news broadcasts, and I use the term news liberally here, they have been very, very popular. They have a successful business model. Now, even if they do have a successful business model, should we allow those kinds of influencers to shape what we think is popular as far as opinion goes? I heard a board member out in Cambridge, in fact, say that students would learn how to defend unpopular ideas if they had to defend their native mascot. That one just made me shake my head, or scratch my head, I should say. I'm thinking, for one thing, I don't know what unpopular ideas this board member was talking about, but I'm also not sure that you should compel or in any way, shape, or form encourage kids to defend something like a native mascot, a race-based mascot, in the hopes that they're going to learn how to defend other unpopular ideas. I mean, but see, these kinds of suggestions that get made are made without thinking about the unintended consequences of such a thing. I mean, look, I think it's fine to encourage people to stand up and defend just causes, even if those just causes, or perhaps especially if those just causes, are unpopular. But I don't think that it's just a good idea to encourage people to just arbitrarily defend unpopular ideas. So, I mean, I guess this is where I wanted to have the conversation, was about how do we address the racism that we not just witness being being targeted towards the people, but how do we address it as victims of that racism? And I know the mascot issue may not seem like the most important or the highest priority when you consider that there are people dying as a result of racism. But the reason I put such an emphasis on the especially on the high school mascot issue is because these schools are cranking out kids that are being indoctrinated with this idea that stereotyping a people is okay, mocking a people is okay, appropriating a culture of a people is okay, and carrying with them out of their school, both grade school, middle school, and high school experience, that they can view people through the lens of the stereotype that they had projected on them through from K through 12. So I think it's important that we don't contaminate the minds of children. Look, I've talked about the doll test before, where even very young children are already affected by racist beliefs, even if it's not coming from school or from home, but just because it's out in the world. And again, without belaboring the doll test, it's this idea that even small black children at 5 years old are being taught that the white baby dolls are the good ones and the black ones are the bad ones. And they are not just taught it, they actually receive that message. And and of course this goes to to reinforcing the idea that a black cop can still be responsible for harboring this notion of white supremacy because of the systemic racism that is embedded in the police department. And so a black cop may view a black person on the street as more of a threat than a white person. Part of that is, that same idea of the doll test that the doll test proves out. But so how do we get over this? And do we? I mean, do we tackle the most blatant forms of racism, or perhaps, and this is part of the reason that I put such a strong emphasis on the mascot issue, is because it may seem more benign, but it's pervasive. I mean, it has been pervasive in pro sports, and it had been in college sports, and it certainly has been in high school sports. And it doesn't matter if you didn't go to a school that has a native mascot, because you probably competed against one. And if you competed against a school that had a native mascot, you may have found yourself saying something very racist about slaughtering the Indians, or something along those lines. And certainly we know that news, sports writers and sports broadcasters, have really had a field day with always making these massacre, analogies when they're talking about native teams with native names. So I don't think it's a small thing to address racism at this level. I'm not suggesting that it's the only place that we address it. And it's certainly, from my standpoint, it's not the only place that it's addressed. I think it's important that we do contextualize some of these debates, and we address just the false information. Look, I'm dealing with the high school that I went to, and they call themselves the Cambridge Indians. Now, the problem that I have is that it's a native race-based mascot. To even have a debate over that definition is bizarre, but that's what you have to have in a town that is like 95% white. And that's what we experience when we go into some of these communities that are calling themselves Indians or warriors or Redskins or savages or Red Raiders or whatever the name might be. Because the point is, while the name does have its own charge to it, its own triggering when you're using a racial slur, it's the practice. It's the whole idea that you've got these towns predominantly of non-native people that are basically appropriating and taking on themselves this identity. I mean, you don't know how many times I'm hearing folks from the town that I went to high school in, and they're saying, no, we are Indians. We are the Cambridge Indians, and I will be a Cambridge Indian for the rest of my life. And my immediate thought is, no, you're not. And while I have a problem with the word Indian because it coming from Columbus and it being a misnomer and it being a word that is imposed upon us, I recognize that word is in the American lexicon as an identifier for Native people, but it's not being used today in the same way. I mean, yes, there's still the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's still the National Congress of the American Indian. There still are the words that are there. But there's also United Negro College Fund, and nobody calls black people Negroes. There's also the NAACP, and yet people aren't referring to black people as colored people anymore. So these words get embedded into these institutions or these organizations, even as the words become archaic. The fact of the matter is, there's not a form you could fill out, whether it's a census form or an application or any governmental form, where when they have race listed, that they have Indian as a race. They may have Asian American in there, which might include an Indian American, but they don't have American Indian. They all say Native American. Not even crazy about that label, but so as I'm battling some of these mascot issues, it isn't just the name. So it isn't just whether the name is a racial slur or if it's something that some people can think is more benign, like Indian or Brave or even Tomahawk. It's the idea that white people predominantly are using Native people as their symbol to call themselves. I mean, I even get into a debate about what is the definition of a mascot? A mascot is the idea of choosing an emblem or an image that is going to represent you in sports or a brand or something like that. Not that you represent the mascot. I mean, and that's how twisted this thing is. And even having that conversation. But this is part of the education issue. And so as I try to have that conversation, of course, look, I could be a polarizing figure because I have addressed this issue. And I allegedly, some people have suggested that my approach is more like the throwing the cherry bomb or the dynamite approach rather than the diplomacy approach. So part of, I guess, what I'm recommending is that even if I am throwing cherry bombs and dynamite, that not everybody else needs to. And perhaps I don't need to. We do need to be I don't think we got to treat the issue with kid gloves. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that we need to have, as our goal, education. We're trying to eradicate the ignorance, not the ignorant, but the ignorance. And I think to do that, we have to be willing to teach. We've got to teach some of the history. We've got to prepare to address that history. But we also have to understand that in spite of our perspective as those who are trying to tackle racism, as awkward as it may be, we have to understand the perspective of the people that we're trying to educate. And at the same time, as even as I'm suggesting this, I realize that there are some people we're never going to get through to. And it makes sense to not get hung up on those people. I anytime you talk about any issue, whether it's substance abuse or whether it's racism, whether it's suicide, we need to pull people back from the precipice. We need to pull them back. We sure don't need to push them over, and we need to do it in a way that is sensitive to the people who are there on that precipice, who may be jumping off to. And not necessarily to a point of no return. And I'm not suggesting that, except for obviously in the case of suicide. But people who can get lost in ideology. I mean, and look, we see the power of some of these ideological pulls, whether it's, again, white supremacy or nationalism or populism or whatever the ism is of the day, I guess. But I think for those of us who are really concerned about this and want to work, and again, when we talk about being an anti-racist, it doesn't mean that we are that we need to pit ourselves against the racist as an enemy, but really to pull them back from that precipice and pull them back from their racist behavior and their racist language or their racist behavior, whatever it is, their actions. So I guess that's really what I'm suggesting here. And part of this is, I'm not saying it's an epiphany for me, but part of it is to suggest that we do need to look at ourselves even as we're addressing these issues. And I know as I do talk to people, I know some people it is real easy to communicate with. And it's real easy for them to understand that, no, we're not, I'm not calling you, the first label, the blatant racist. But you have to understand that some of the behavior that you're participating in is harmful to other people. And it's harmful because it is born out of this notion that you have the right to behave this way and you have the right to victimize other people or appropriate images or identity or view people as less than you, that somehow they don't have the right. And so whether we're talking about Native people or Black people or anybody who is in the marginalized or the oppressed category, once that oppression becomes acceptable by the dominant culture and becomes embedded in the systems, the institutions, the governmental processes, it gets real hard to dig that out of there. I mean, look, we've seen things like affirmative action and so many other attempts that oftentimes have some other collateral damage that gets done, and people turn it around. They say, well, now I'm a white person and I'm being persecuted against. So it is a real challenge, and I'm not saying that there's one answer to all of these challenges, but I think we've got to be in this for the long game. Look, even today, as I view my old high school, the likelihood is next month the school board will vote probably 3-1 to retire the native mascot. They will retire the Indians. But the reality is, a mere couple of months later, they're going to have a board election, and Cambridge has a small school board, and they may put 2 pro mascot people on that board, and they may reverse the vote on retiring the mascot. That doesn't mean it's over. And my advice to those who are supporting me and are basically, whether they're supporting me or not, are against the use of a native mascot out there, I say again, remember, it's the long game. And some things are going to happen that happen beyond our control. We have to stay at it. We have to stay at it, whether we are addressing police violence, whether you're addressing use of inappropriate language and native mascots, and this idea that somebody else gets to define a people and then take that identity for themselves. Yeah, we have to stay at this, even though there are setbacks. I mean, some people view the last 4 years of Trump as this major setback, but yes, I agree on some levels, but we still needed some progress back during the Obama administration and and the Bush administration and the Clinton administration before that and all of that stuff. We always have a goal to achieve. And as we knock down some of these goals, we need to set goals, further down the road. And we need to keep at it. That's the human condition, right? That's what we're faced with. And while we are always going to get pushback, and that pushback may get very politicized, I think we as not just the activist community, but again, I go back to this idea that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So how do we get the silent to speak up? And I'm not saying lead a campaign. I'm just saying speak up, just not remain silent. I think that's what we have to do. And this is where, while we may not confront directly the blatant racists, I think those that may harbor some of that racism, even if they don't express it on a daily basis, or may question about whether a behavior is quote unquote racist or not, those are the people we need to reach out to. And our silence doesn't do that. And so as we approach any issue that may be that demonstrates white privilege, or sometimes puts in plain view white fragility because of the fear that they are losing something, I think we have to put it into context and say, yeah, you are going to lose some things. If you've enjoyed white privilege, then you're going to lose some of that privilege. That's just the nature of the world that we live in. And the longer you dig in to maintain and fight for that privilege of calling yourselves Indians, or that privilege of hiring somebody based on race, or whatever that privilege is, as long as you dig into that and you find ways around it, or what you think is a compromise. I mean, this among the things that I've heard is, well, we don't do the tomahawk chop anymore, and we don't wear headdresses to our football games anymore. Well, congratulations. So in other words, that there was at some point your behavior associated with this practice of native mascots does cross a line that is racist. But you think there's someplace on this side of that line that still is kind of racist, but that you don't have to. It's a safe space. And what we're saying is, look, there's no compromise where we say there is an acceptable level of racism. The goal for all of us, especially those of us who are activists, is to eradicate racism. And if we accept a compromise on racism, and now I realize that those who are practicing this, who enjoy this white privilege, think that, well, I'm going to give up a little bit. I'm not going to do the tomahawk chop anymore. And they think that they've accommodated us. And we have to say, no, you're taking a step, but it's not the full step. So I believe that this is where we have to, and not just hate on those people who are willing to compromise, but not accept that the compromise accomplishes the end goal of eradicating racism. So again, as we wind down the month of February, ironically the shortest month of the year that gets attributed to Black history, I think it's important that we not forget that every day is an opportunity to confront at some level some of this systemic racism that we all face. And the best way to continue to support systemic racism is silence. Thanks for listening. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.